Okay, if you want to begin, there may be some more people drifting in, but I think it's good to start.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Yes, it is still morning. Welcome to my presentation on modern communication skills, including how to address fake news, which divides itself into two parts, I think, and that's the way I'm going to present it. Obviously, I'm very conscious that we could have a PhD level course on each of those two things, but what I'm going to do is really just give you a kind of subjective overview from my long experience in these areas. So I'm going to begin with a sort of broad look at modern communication skills, as it seems to me. So if we can change the slide, please, Lauren. Beginning with written communication, I would have written a shorter letter if I'd had more time. Henry David Thoreau, the 19th century philosopher. And I would say to you that you don't need to be apologetic or feeling there's something unscholarly about keeping your messaging to, remember, committed and uncommitted audiences alike. Keeping it short. Brevity can be the soul of wit, and I speak as one who, over many years writing blogs and scripts for broadcasting, I would work on my first draft to slim it down to make the language more direct, to give it greater impact, maybe add a little bit here and there, but as H.L. Mencken, the great American journalist, said, you have to learn to kill off your little darlings. Sometimes diffuse language is really a bit of a self-indulgence for the writer rather than for the audience. So don't think that keeping it short is unscholarly. The Gettysburg Address was famous for being relatively short by the standards of these things. And in a similar vein, the great man Albert Einstein said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. How true when communicating with lay audiences. Don't oversimplify. The second sentence in what he says there is equally important, but keeping it direct, as Chris Whitty himself eventually found out that his over-elaborate graphics were frankly bamboozling people to some extent, and he got the message eventually that he had to keep those charts relatively simple and to the point if he was going to get the message home. And then forgive me if this is a statement of the obvious to you, but to quote the great man, another great man, Winston Churchill, this pudding has no theme, take it away. And I sometimes reading written communications, not specifically from yourselves, but from a variety of organizations, what I see is a catalogue of ideas. What I see is a kind of assortment of thoughts and sometimes opinions, which would be more effective if they were drawn together into some kind of coherent thematic flow that a lay audience would be able to latch onto. So whenever I was preparing to write something for a blog, say on a complicated thing, I often reminded myself of, the pudding had to have a theme. And also I used the analogy sometimes of the Christmas pudding, that you put more and more in. Sometimes adding more in doesn't actually improve the pudding. It just makes it more difficult to digest. So bear that in mind. Please change the graphic, please, Lauren. So written communications, I'm going to give you a recent example of good practice, and then I'm going to show you a rogue example of absolutely rotten practice. Good practice came last month from my former employer, the BBC, for whom I was the BBC political editor in the West Midlands, and also working in Westminster from time to time as a member of the lobby as well. And the BBC put out a news release saying, and this was a headline grabber, that jobs in journalism were going to be devolved to the regions. And all the newspapers latched onto it. There's a substantial degree of commentary about it. What was also in the release, so the news release mustn't be dishonest, it was in there, but some way down in the text, was that a number of jobs in the Westminster end of the operations, where I spent quite a significant chunk of my time working at Westminster, was going to take a hit to the department in BBC Westminster that serves the regions and the local radio newsrooms. A substantial hit there. When it came to the write-ups in the papers, the devolution of jobs, sexy headline, that got all the attention. And with the column inches at a premium, and indeed space on online sites at a premium, the business of the job cuts in the BBC's Westminster office were, if I can borrow from the late lamented television situation comedy, they were the donkey, the dead donkey that got dropped, much, I'm sure, to the satisfaction of the BBC. Change the graphic, please, Lauren. Here now, coming up, is the absolute rogue example from Severn Trent Water, an organisation which has very deep pockets. So I can't understand why their communications team got this so badly wrong. Do you remember there was this government special advisor who quite notoriously on the day of 9/11 said that it was a good day to bury bad news? Well, this piece of paper, which was pushed through the letterbox of myself and all my neighbours, is a very, very, very bad way of burying bad news, and instantly became something of a laughingstock in our neighbourhood because it drones on with all this guff at the top about what wonderful water we get. We actually get wonderful water courtesy of the infrastructure that's put in by our Victorian forefathers, bringing water from mid-Wales on a series of elaborate aqueducts, which are an engineering triumph. Oh, and then sort of halfway down, you get to the point that we may have to have road closures. Well, as we speak now, we are in the middle of this process of road closures where something like the Berlin Wall has been erected about 150 yards from my home, cutting me off from the rest of the neighbourhood. To get to just 200 yards down the road involves a 2.5–3 mile detour. So by making a bit of a spectacle of Severn Trent here today, I can assure you it's all about my own personal vengeance and spite. But they damn well deserve this because it's a rotten example of trying to wrap up the good news in a load of guff. And then at the bottom, guess what? This is the clincher. We may even have to interrupt your water supply. It just gets worse. Even worse, actually, because there is a good news story lurking in here, but you wouldn't know it from this release. The good news story, unspoken, is fixing the infrastructure, for which there is widespread public support. And if that had been prominently displayed in this release, I firmly believe that the local neighbourhoods would have responded to it not with ridicule, but with a certain amount of patience and forbearance, and a certain amount of understanding, that you have to crack an egg to make an omelette. So, as I say, it is a real mystery to me how Severn Trent, with all their resources, managed to get that so badly wrong. Lose that one, please, Lauren. Let's move on to spoken communication, because I'm very much aware that, especially in the present circumstances, many of you are appearing on broadcast radio and television and online output. And so here are a few thoughts from my experience of these situations. The biggest piece of advice that I can give you is have the confidence when you go into a studio or when you connect by Zoom that you know your stuff. Don't carry bundles of notes. I've interviewed people who've been sort of shielding notes on their knees and things, and I felt like saying, just get rid of the notes. You know your stuff. You will be trapped in those notes, and you won't respond as spontaneously as you should be doing to the questions. Just know your stuff. The other thing, which I think is a failure of all these media charm schools, I think I'm not alone in being able to smell people who've come out of the media charm school from 50 paces, because certain of the techniques are just so blatant. And to me, they smack not just of the charm offensive, but of offensive charm. There are myriad examples, but I have time just to give you one particularly lamentable one, where the interviewer asks the question, would it not be a lamentable failure of public health policy if ABC? And back comes the response, courtesy of the media charm school, I'll tell you what would be a lamentable failure of health policy if XYZ. That is an absolutely blatant tactic for changing the subject. And I honestly don't believe it works. I'm speaking here about confrontational interviews, of course. There are other ways of doing it as well, which I used to practice myself, which is called the sort of gently leading up the garden path. And a particular example I can give you, and it's all done with kindness, this one, was in the run-up to the 2015 general election, when you remember David Cameron's Conservative Party were pretty much under pressure from UKIP, and there was a certain amount of speculation going around about the possibility of a Conservative UKIP electoral pact on the ground, poo-pooed by the Tory High Command, but the chat was certainly doing the rounds. And I did a TV interview with a really staunch Tory backbench Brexiteer who I knew had friends in UKIP, and I knew he talked to them. Interview starts, he's guarded, he's on the party line, no pacts, no deals, and all the rest of that. And I just sort of gently, but you don't have a lot of common. You want this, that, and the other. And there's a lot of common, yeah, and you know a lot of it. And by the end of it, I had gently manoeuvred him into saying, yeah, it wouldn't be a bad idea if we talked to UKIP, and if we're talking to them, well, inevitably the question of some kind of ground level pact or arrangement comes up, which delivered a headline for me. So it's not all done by sort of absolute tough guy confrontation. There are other ways to do it. So beware of the nice, genial, easygoing interviewer with a smile. Next screen, please, Lauren. The rule of three. Well, what's that? It's something mysterious about the public, the human brain, that it seems to be able to absorb messages in threes particularly well and struggles with other numbers. So if you really have a message to communicate, number one, don't be too apologetic about ramming home the same message again and again and again, especially in a broadcast interview, because if you want to talk about the price of fish, delivering a quote about the price of fish in one answer and then talking about it again in another answer does no harm at all, because the broadcast output may well clip you, cut you down into clips, and one outlet may run the one clip with the mention for the price of fish, and another outlet may use the other answer in which you also mentioned the price of fish, which is message. But why? What do I mean by the rule of three? If you really have a set of ideas, a set of messages that you absolutely want to emblazon on the public consciousness, three is the magic number. And I can think of no better example than what turned out to be an extremely powerful slogan: stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. It worked, and it came in a batch of three. So what do I mean then by how, where, what, and why? This is a matter of how you prepare for an interview. Good journalists are generally told to try to avoid yes-no questions. How, where, what, and why? How much, where, when? These are questions that will elicit information. And that fundamentally actually is what the interviewer is trying to do, or should be, not necessarily having an argy-bargy, but to try and get information. So as you prepare for an interview, it would be sensible to think of what are the lines of questions, not just about what I know, what is the interviewer likely to be thinking about as he or she approaches this subject? And if you can prepare yourself for a series of how, where, what, and whys, you will be more likely to be on your mettle when the question comes up. Limit the damage, accentuate the positive. Well, yes, Severn Trent could have done themselves a lot of good. As I say, they could have presented a tricky message if they'd actually talked about the infrastructure. The BBC, in my earlier example, did a very good job of accentuating the positive. I'm not saying be deceitful, hide the tricky message. I'm not saying that. I'm at no point am I talking in this spiel about oversimplification or dishonesty. But what I am talking about is what the late Alan Clark, the former Tory minister, in his famous diaries, and indeed at a select committee hearing, talked about being economical with the actuality. Make the journalists earn their money when you're into those tricky areas. Don't, as it were, go out of your way to lay it all on silver salver. So long as you're not guilty of concealment, make them work for it. Final point, another revisiting of Winston Churchill, who, what he actually said in May 1940 was, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, 4 of them. But what they are generally publicly remembered as are blood, sweat, and tears, 3. I rest my case. 3 works. Right, change the graphics, and again, please, Lauren, because we're now embarking into the world of fake news. And the bad news I have for you is that there is no magic bullet on this. This is societal is not my favorite word, because I feel it's one of those words that needs to be pronounced in a Californian accent. But I'm afraid much of what's driving fake news is about society. It is societal and goes way beyond the scope of this conversation that we're having here today. But what it does do is set a premium on clear, authoritative messaging that leaves no ambiguity, no vacuum, into which the self-appointed prophets on social media will pile in with alacrity. And this article by the science editor of the Times, Tom Whipple, back in December, when AstraZeneca and Pfizer were turning out their news releases about the good news that a vaccine was on the way. This one from AZ followed shortly after the Pfizer one. And if you remember, all the informed comment at the time on the Today programme and elsewhere from the experts was saying, well, remember, we're only dealing with information by news release here. We don't have peer review. But on the face of it, and this is where I think the ambiguity that Tom Whipple refers to, did not only AstraZeneca, but also the public a disservice by presenting the misguided impression that the AZ vaccine was seriously inferior to the Pfizer one, which experts who I know say it isn't. They're both excellent. But by that stage, it was very difficult to repair the damage. And the self-appointed prophets were in there, and a certain amount of the disinformation or the unduly pessimistic approach to AZ, the damage was done, and it extended even to the quasi-ineffective president of France and the soon-to-be ex-chancellor of Germany. So try to get your messaging as unambiguous and as clear as you can. I think it may be that in this case, for perfectly respectable reasons, AZ were trying to respect the science. It comes down to the difference between proof of absence and absence of proof, so far as the recipients at the older age range of their vaccine was concerned. But there's no question that it did, well, what a shame it did that, because it was a sort of open sesame. And let's just move on with the graphics. 1, 2, please, Lauren. And again, that's it, because here we see what are actually the ripostes. And this is where I believe this is how you do respond to a tricky problem. You can only you can't solve society's problems, but as practitioners, as people who, if I can put it crudely, have skin in the fight, this is where you can use your expertise. We see Dr. Carsten Vartel of the Leibniz Research Centre saying the AZ vaccine has a PR problem, not so much a scientific problem. That was very helpful. Even more so, Natasha Loder in The Economist, I saw some very learned medical expositions of this argument about the relative risk of having and not having the vaccine. The human brain, the lay brain, not particularly good actually at quantifying varying degrees of remote risk. Not very good at that. But she, in a very simple, almost brutal journalistic sentence, says what medical specialists often took many paragraphs to say. The side effects of the suspension of the AZ vaccine include moderate to severe COVID-19, organ damage and death. Well, that's saying it, isn't it? And I think lay and expert audiences will understand that. And then this final one, which I think is extremely powerful, from Sir Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of NHS England. 3 sentences, rule of 3 again. We are not just battling COVID, we also face a pandemic of misinformation and mistrust. We must fight them both with equal determination. 3 sentences beginning with the word we, and it's back to that point about you being the medical practitioners, the people with the authority who are out there in the fight. Whatever you do, don't berate the self-appointed prophets, because you'll just get extra pushback from them. I was disappointed to see recently that the chief finance officer of AZ, them again, accused their critics of being ignorant and uneducated. Bad practice. You just get a more powerful response and backlash against it. Change the graphic, please, Lauren, and again, I think. And here is another example, classic example of someone who is out there and speaks with the authority of being in there, showing and telling. Show and tell is one of the big maxims in television. Match your actions to your words. This is the imam of a mosque in Birmingham appearing on the BBC News at 10, explaining why his mosque was being opened as a vaccination centre. Absolutely wonderful, a powerful statement against some of the misinformation in social media that the vaccines were at odds with halal principles. Well, there's no more potent testimony than that. He was just laying it on the line by proving that it was halal and it was absolutely fine. Let's just skip to the final one now, please. And this is a contribution to the BBC. Isn't it interesting that we've had what feels in many ways like a standstill, but paradoxically, it has accelerated various factors and contributing to broadcast and online outlets via Zoom and Skype and all the rest of it was starting before the pandemic. But my goodness, this standstill has really accelerated that. And I think it is here to stay. And I think it is here to stay. It's worth saying that you should give a certain amount of attention to the way in which you present via these mechanisms. And Dr. Lisa McNally, the Director of Public Health in Sandwell, has been one of the most frequent contributors to online and broadcast outlet, partly, yes, because Sandwell has been something of a hotspot, but also because she's a very effective communicator. And that partly has to do with the way in which she's set this up. She has a sort of interesting background without it being distracting. So no one's going to be saying, oh, Ethel, look at that. I've done my best to provide you with a background which is not devoid of interest, but at the same time isn't so sparkingly a distraction that you really want me to turn my camera around and show you the curtain material, although for an extra fee, I would consider that. But basically what I'm saying is have a bit of interest in there. And above all, the level of the camera. So often you see people who've set their computers up where they press the keyboard. It reminds me of a bit of advice that I was given long ago by the late great Dale Winton, who was a presenter of any number of light entertainment shows and the National Lottery draw and all that sort of thing. And I was about to do a live outside broadcast with him. And just before we went on the air, he said, just tilt your head up a little bit, darling. And so I did. And obviously to do that in this situation, you have to have the camera level with your eye line. Because he said, if you do that, it takes 10 years off you. It takes 10 years off your life. If you bring your head up a little bit, gets rid of all the jowls. What you mustn't do, of course, is look sort of down your nose as though you're sneering at anybody. But it's a useful little bit of advice from Dale Winton about how to look your best, present yourself at your best, and everything else, the confidence, knowing your stuff, will flow from that. I hope that's been helpful. I know I'm trying to allow a little bit of time for questions. So with a little bit of help from Lauren, I think I'm open to your thoughts and observations.
We did have a question last time we didn't get around to, which was how can we get the likes of the Daily Mail on side rather than fighting against them?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it comes to the issue that you really do have to be aware of the audience that you are working to. And the example that comes to mind, of course, is Chris Whitty, who I say speaks with the authority of a thoroughgoing medical practitioner. He has the air of a man who's just come off the wards. And yet, the power of much of what he had to say, in my view, was reinforced by his recognition that there are other economic and societal factors to bear in mind. It's not just health policy in isolation. So to take the example of the Daily Mail, again, from what I said earlier, don't feel you just have to berate them and say, you know, we take issue with the Daily Mail. What I think is good PR is to take the energy from the incoming, take that energy and swing it around, the same energy, rather than batting it straight back, almost like a slingshot rather than a racket or a bat. And what I would do, and this is just a sort of off the cuff thought about the Daily Mail, is to say, look, we all want to get to a point where our lives are as much reopened and as we used to know them as possible. And the best way to do that is by being patient and respecting these rules, knowing that there is a common consensus on the part of those who form these rules, and you, our readers, the male readers, that's where we all want to get. I'm aware that there is a sort of caucus of opinion that the doors should be opened now. And I think there you do actually have to say, well, we respect the view, we sympathise with it. This is where we want to get in the end. So what we come down to is an issue of timing rather than principle, something along those lines. But be, as it were, cooperative, answer cooperatively rather than confrontationally.
And yeah, that leads on to another question. Keen to explore how to frame those messages effectively, as it's hard and controversial at times to tell someone that maybe they're incorrect. So
yeah, I think I sort of touched on that. It is never a good idea just to say you're playing wrong when dealing with an adversarial position. So there's an old principle as well, which is listen, agree, discuss. And I think, if you can find a way of demonstrating that you've listened to the point, this is a bit of sort of basic sort of interpersonal skills, isn't it? Mm. But I think that logical thinking, clarity of thought, not losing your cool and just resorting to the sort of red button, but trying to find some shades of grey that we can agree on is a good way into this. But above all, I think I'm on this, where you try and capture the energy of the sentiment behind the question and use it, and put a little bit of your own logic into swinging it around like a swing shot rather than a straight rebuttal. I think that's the way I'd approach that. That's certainly how I try to do it in journalism. I mean, one little thought that I also, since we're mentioning the previous time I've done this, when I was touching on the softly, catchy monkey approach to interviewing, I reminded the earlier session of something that the late John Smith, the former, now departed leader of the Labour Party, said about being interviewed by Sir David Frost, who had a reputation for being a rather sort of gentle interviewer by comparison with Paxman and Humphreys. But he said of David Frost, who had a way of asking what appeared to be gentle questions, which established a series of logical positions, and then in the final stages, exploring any contradictions that had arisen between the various logical positions into which he had carefully placed the interviewee. And John Smith said, Sir David's questions are instantly disarming, subsequently beguiling, and ultimately lethal. And I think that is an interesting point in itself. Beware the smiling, gentle interviewer. He can lead you up the garden path, he or she. But I think, actually, in answer to the question, it goes some way towards responding to that question that Lawrence just mentioned, that if you can gently absorb some of the energy of the question that you've received, with which you disagree, you think it's wrong, but absorb some of the energy of it, and respond by carrying that energy to a logical position, and again to another logical position, and again to another logical position, and then you've got your three logical positions with which you deliver your ever so logical correct conclusion without at any stage telling them you're wrong.
They're wrong, yeah. No, brilliant. Well, that's a fabulous note to end on. Thank you, Patrick. It's been another great session. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed it too. Thank you all for your help, and thanks for joining me on it.
And I believe you can head to the networking sessions now. So thanks very much.